Hey guys, what is up and welcome to a new Tesla update video. So today, as per usual, let's go over Tesla stock, let's go over the market, let's talk about what is happening to Tesla, what we can expect moving forward, and all that good stuff. If you enjoyed, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to hit that like button. This is not financial advice, and I am not a financial advisor. And of course, if you enjoy my technical analysis, thoughts on the charts, etc., well, again, I do share my thoughts, post updates with my members every single day as the market is trading. In my YouTube membership section, of course, that link is down below, so definitely check that out. Again, where I share all my thoughts, post updates, mainly on Tesla stock for the first tier, right? The first tier is just $3 a month. All my Tesla updates. Sometimes I'll talk about the general broader market like SPY and QQ and things like that, but the main focus, of course, is Tesla. $5, however, also adds NVDA to that for all my NVIDIA updates. And then $7 also adds all my non-Tesla, non-NVIDIA updates on other stocks that I cover. When there's something worth mentioning, I share, chart ideas, etc. And on Discord, I do chart requests with members on the weekend. So again, we'd love to have you there. Definitely check that out. That link is below. Jumping into it, however, Tesla holding up a pretty decent day today, closing just a smidge, we'll say, above $335, which in my opinion is actually fairly constructive from the bullish perspective. So not too shabby overall, especially on a day where the market was, ever so slightly in the red, but you can see the market is holding that 9 exponential moving average. And honestly, a lot of people are pretty bearish on the market. Honestly, I actually think the market looks like it's, how much higher can the market go before a correction? Well, I actually think the market still looks pretty bullish because you can see, for instance, just as a quick example on SPY, we had these rejections over here on the all-time highs. And then, of course, we ended up breaking this, what could have been a bearish double top, but we ended up breaking not only past that, but we're now coming back to retest that right at the 9 exponential moving average and even looking like a little bit of a bull flag type pattern setting up here on the market as well. So, if this market continues to rip higher, the bears will not be very, very happy. But obviously, keep in mind, as we inch closer into September and September itself, that is historically at least one of the weakest months of the year, if not the weakest month of the year for the market on average. So let's see how that goes. The one thing I will admit is the volume today in the market was absolutely abysmal. QQ, SPY, horrendous looking volume. The volume today was atrociously low. Tesla as well, NVIDIA, pretty much every stock across the board has had pretty abysmal looking volume today. I'm not really sure, except for Medics. I'm not really sure why, but it is what it is. But looking specifically at Tesla stock, right, what are we looking at? Well, the overall, again, sometimes one thing I like to sometimes do is I like to look at it in the most simplistic way possible, right? We can dissect and we will go into the, more, gritty information, zoomed in 1 hour, etc. But sometimes, it's nice to just take a quick glance and, it's like close your eyes, take a peek look, a quick look. And what do you see first? Like, what's the first thing that's, that you're seeing on the chart? And sometimes that usually ends up being more than enough. And sometimes if you dive a little too deep, you start overthinking and overcomplicating something that otherwise could be pretty simple. So in that perspective, if I just look at the chart very quickly, not overthinking it, not overanalyzing it, nice, quick, simple, observation here, what do I see? Well, pretty much the same thing I've been talking about the last few days where, despite some more weakness than I would have liked to see, Tesla was still barely hanging on, and it's still pretty much making this, well, in my opinion, what looks to be kind of a bull flag, right? Nice move off the lows. I took away the bottom thing because we don't really care about it anymore unless we break down, then I'll care about it. So I took it away for now. But off of the lows, nice move up, broke these highs over here, and now we're looking into a bull flag back into the exponential moving averages, and essentially trying to take what was, of course, an area of resistance and, definitely on a little bit of thin ice on Friday, but, we were holding on by a smidge. But, ended up, or at least still trying to essentially turn those very low 330s pretty much into support, right? Pretty much into support when, of course, it was in the passive resistance. So to me right now, this does look still like a bullish setup. Now, will this actually play out like a bullish setup? Well, that's, of course, something we'll talk about a little bit more when we go into the 1 hour time frame. But as of right now, this to me, it's hard for me not to look at this as, still a setup that, definitely leans in the more bullish side for sure, right? This is what I've been saying for quite some time. Despite Friday's a little bit weaker than ideal close, it wasn't fully invalidated yet. And also you can argue the fact that we're essentially retesting these trend lines right here. Now there's 2 trend lines here. I added 2, one of which is the one we've always had, which is going to be this one right here, right? This is that top of the pennant breakout that we had. And now we're arguably, we have retested that. So far, so good. So that's looking pretty solid. And the other trend line, this big one I've kind of brought up here, is the one from all-time highs. If I zoom out over here, you can see that's from all-time highs. We got a kind of a rejection right around here. All right, we got pretty close to it right around here. We got pretty close to it right around here. And then we're also arguably pretty much getting more or less, close to that retest of that trend line as well on Friday. Not exactly, but pretty close. So again, depending on which perspective you want to take a look at it, they all overall show a similar idea. This one to me is the cleanest, but nonetheless, the idea is the fact that we ended up still breaking this high, which I like. We ended up obviously flagging back into it on decreasing volume, which I like. We're holding the bullish exponential moving averages and the MACD is bullish. Whenever I see these kind of signs on pretty much any ticker, yeah, this it's hard for me not to look at this from a bullish lens, right? It really is. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean it will play out, and I'll give you what levels, I don't want to see broken by the bulls, or I guess by the bears technically. So I'll go over that very, very soon. But overall, this still looks like a nice looking bullish setup. And at the very least, if this continues holding the low 330s essentially, and pretty much 330 itself, then I would expect, honestly, potentially even by the end of this week, a test of this fair value gap, a closer, more concrete, if you will, test of this fair value gap at about 350, maybe the very low 350s, so like 352, something like that. I wouldn't be fully surprised if we get that test of that range. Honestly, maybe even by the end of this week, right? It really, really wouldn't fully shock me. But all in all, look at this, right? We had a nice breakout on volume, right? You can see the volume exceeded the average volume over here, which is this kind of white squiggly line. And then, of course, like I said, we're flagging on decreasing volume. These are all signs of textbook bull flag setups, right? Kind of the same way it did over here, right? If I go all the way over here, exactly the same thing happened, right? What happened when we had a nice move off the lows? Pretty much the exact same way we had this nice move off the lows over here, right? Almost identical, to be completely honest with you. And then, of course, what do? We had a nice little bull flag of about a week and a half, right? We're pretty much doing the exact same thing. It's been about a week and a half almost, right? Sometime, I think tomorrow or Wednesday is pretty much that week and a half roughly. And then also same idea. We ended up, on slightly increased than average volume on this breakout. And then of course we ended up having that bull flag on consistently decreasing volume. And that's exactly what we're doing, right? Pretty much the exact same setup. It's just the overall volume on the breakout and this right here just now on the bull flag overall is just a little bit lower than back then. But the principle and the overall setup, I guess you can say, very, 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 very similar. So let's continue monitoring that as we go forward. But overall, that's kind of still what I see with this setup. I still see a bullish setup. I still see a bull flag. And I still see something that the bulls, it's the balls in their court. Now, like I said, nothing is perfect. Does this mean it has to play out? Does this mean it has to break out and it has to go back to, the low 350s, potentially even easily going up to, in my opinion, eventually a 365 to potentially, about 380s. Those are my main three targets at the upside, right? Doesn't mean it has to do this though. Can it maybe still fall apart and break down pretty aggressively? Of course, right? But let's talk about that. What levels do I not want to see lost by the bulls, or what levels do the bears want to take out essentially to reverse this back down, right? What levels do they want to do? Well, those levels are pretty simple. I mean, 330-ish is the first one, right? If we start closing daily candles below 330, that's red flag number one. That I would not want to see. That to me would be a concerning sign. And, I would definitely start kind of, questioning the momentum more or less. But that's red flag number one. The bigger red flag to me, and, sometimes you want to give stocks a little bit of leeway because, sometimes you get those sweeps, you get those kind of moves where it tries to trick you out, things like that. So I like to give them a little bit of a buffer window, if that makes sense. And the buffer window for me, in my opinion, at least for Tesla stock, is about Friday's low, right? Friday's low is around that sort of 327-ish range. If we lose 327 and we close a daily candle below Friday's low, that to me will be a pretty large red flag. That to me would be arguably a very large red flag, actually. That to me would make me very much question this momentum, very much question if there's any bullishness left in the stock to really send it higher, which at the moment, it seems like there still absolutely is. But if that were to happen, that would really make me question the overall structure and the overall setup that we're kind of, getting presented here from the bullish perspective. And I would absolutely go back to, at the very least, neutral, if not maybe even starting to lean bearish. However, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And until that happens, I continue moving forward here with a more bullish perspective for sure, right? That's kind of what I've been saying for the most part. So let's see how this goes. Again, we need to see more time, we need to see more candles. Excuse me, but the daily perspective and analysis, I guess, if you will, is something along the lines of that. Now let's go to the 1 hour time frame. I already have a few drawings here. You can see this is when I was, talking to my members about, but this is kind of what I want to see, right? I was telling my members how we're on the verge of this breakout, right? We had this nice kind of falling wedge, if you will, breakout, right? And you can see the price has officially exited. Now, the one thing people confuse sometimes, and usually it does play out like this, where you have a bull flag, falling wedge, whatever, and you finally break out, then you usually, rock it, in this case higher, or sometimes, if it's a rising wedge and it'll look something like this, then you kind of, go lower. But not always, right? Not always. Usually, sometimes what it can mean, just simply put, is the fact that, well, you're just not descending as fast as you were anymore, right? So you can absolutely still just go sideways. So what I see from here is the fact that on the bright side, we did break out, right? We did break out of this trend line. The upper trend line is the most important trend line, in my opinion, right? Whenever you're going down, the upper trend line is important. Whenever you're going up, the bottom trend line is important to keep that specific momentum intact, because technically while we were going down, right, technically within this situation we were bearish, right, while we're within it in the smaller time frame. But then once you break up out of this trend line, you're no longer going down at the same pace anymore, right? Because technically speaking, we could have rejected and continued going down like this and kept getting rejected at that trend line and kept essentially going down at the same pace, right? But we're not doing that anymore, which is good, right? So the fact that we broke out of that alone is already a pretty good a start, in my opinion. Now, the next thing I want to do, and this is when it comes down to more of like a structure thing, if you will, on the chart, is, well, okay, so when we were going down, what were we doing? We started making, well, from higher highs, higher lows, into lower low, lower high, lower low, lower high. So we are actually still, despite breaking out, still technically printing a lower high. So what needs to happen? Well, one of two things, whichever is first, but ideally the second one is more important. But the first one, of course, is, well, if we get any retracement back down here, so about, let's say 331, 330, we could still potentially print this potential looking bullish inverted head and shoulders. That's kind of what I'll be looking for, right? But as we're printing these lower lows, lower highs, the only thing to really stop this trend, on top of obviously breaking out of this trend line, is to start printing higher highs, higher lows. So what we can do now that we broke out of this trend line, is if we get any retracement first, which is the possibility, but as long as we hold around here, and especially pretty much the most important thing is hold Friday's low, all this could be is just printing the first fresh higher low. So instead of making these lower lows, lower highs like this, which could still be a lower low here, I want to see lower low, lower high, lower low, lower high, higher low. And then from that higher low, you make that base into a higher high, right? That's step number one, right? That's what could happen first. And that's what I would like to see, right? And then this would be that fresh higher high off of this one here. However, the other option is we just go straight into making a fresh higher high, right? So this could be that final lower low. And then of course, off this breakout, we essentially break out and make this high right here. That was the previous pivot point before we made this fresh lower low into a fresh higher high. And this breaks that trend. We start setting fresh higher highs, higher lows, and we essentially break this downtrend of lower lows, lower highs. Hopefully this all makes sense. It sounds like word jumble I'm just speaking. Hopefully it makes sense to some extent of what I'm trying to explain, but essentially I'm just talking about reworking the structure from a bullish lower low, lower high into, a bearish lower low, lower high into a bullish higher high, higher low. And that's kind of what I'm looking for next. And that's what it seems like the bulls will look to accomplish next. And that's kind of what I would expect, right? Based on how the 1 hour looks like, based on how the daily looks like, the setups do look like they want to go ahead and do that. But again, to me, we really want to go ahead and avoid making a fresh lower low, because that would not only start invalidating some pretty important technicals on the daily, but this will just be another lower high into another lower low, and then that unfortunate chain of events continues. So that's what I'll keep watching. Something else I like to look at when we start trending down to the downside like this with lower lows, lower highs, is sometimes when it starts getting close to the trend changing, you'll see that the lower lows are less low, if that makes sense. So for instance, here you can see from this high, we went pretty aggressively low to set the first lower low. Then we had a nice higher high, but then this lower low you can see is not as low from the previous low compared to before. So it's like the movement to the downside is slowing down, if that makes sense, right? And that's kind of what these wedges are for, to kind of illustrate that in a better example, I guess, visually easier to see. So, the fact that we started getting these kind of lower lows, but they're less lower low, it's not like aggressively lower low, it's just slightly lower low. Sometimes that also starts giving you ideas or thoughts of the trend is starting to shift as well in that sense. And, the sellers are losing steam. Anyways, that's a whole lot of words, jumble wumble, whatever. Hopefully it makes sense. Hopefully what I just said isn't confusing, I guess. But all in all, that's kind of what I'm looking at right now on kind of the daily time frame, which still looks very bullish to me. This still just looks like a bull flag into the EMAs on decreasing volume. Pretty textbook. I actually might add to my position tomorrow if we get any open weakness closer to 330, to be honest. But again, as long as Friday's low holds, I do remain bullish. At the very least, in my opinion, I really wouldn't be shocked to see about 350, maybe even end of this week. But that's kind of what I'm seeing right now. And then the weekly time frame looks like it wants to try for another breakout. Despite last week's potentially not so sexy looking candle, we still ended up holding this sort of 330-ish range, which all these weeks back then could not do. But last week, by a smidge, barely hung on. So as long as this week shows some level of strength, I think the bulls are absolutely still in control here with the MACD yet again, looking for a potential bullish flip. All in all, that's what I got. Options flow on Tesla stock, pretty mixed, but bullish flow slightly dominating. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.